This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Are you a professional pillow fighter? Or a 9-to-5 low-cost time travel agent? Or maybe real estate sales on Mars is your profession? It doesn't matter. Whatever it is you do, however complex or intricate, Monday.com can help you organize, orchestrate, and make it more efficient. Monday.com is the one centralized platform for everything work-related. And with Monday.com, work is just easier. Monday.com, for whatever you run. Go to Monday.com to learn more.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
Need a holiday gift that will keep her sparkling all year long? Blue Nile, the original online jeweler, has experts on hand 24/7 who can help you find the perfect piece. Beyond that, Blue Nile makes the gifting experience easier than ever, with guaranteed free shipping and returns, as well as a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Right now, get 30% off jewelry at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com for 30% off. BlueNile.com.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello and welcome to Writers on Film. My name's John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Clark Collis, the author of You've Got Red on You, How Shaun of the Dead Was Brought to Life. Clark has been a writer and is a writer for Entertainment Weekly, and his book is a deep dive into the making of one of the best zomcoms ever made. In fact, probably one of the inaugural movies in that genre, a low-budget film which propelled many of its stars and certainly its director into international fame, Simon Pegg, Nick Frost, and of course the director Edgar Wright, who has a new film out at the moment, or I'm not sure how new it is exactly, but Last Night in Soho, which is I think currently in cinemas. And might even be available for streaming. If you enjoy our conversation, please remember to like, send reviews. I've noticed on Apple we've got 14 reviews, 5-star reviews as well, so very, very good. And the more of those, the better. The more we get, the more the podcast will appear and will be shared by other people and be liked and listened to by other people, and that's all to the good. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
My first experience was seeing it at the AMC Cinema in Union Square in New York. I moved to New York in 2002. Really loved it. I lived in London for quite a while. New York's very much a sort of London-y town, really, with the Tube and the sort of, I guess, bar culture. But still, I did miss London, and I loved horror movies and zombie movies. So frankly, if someone's going to make a zombie movie about a bunch of Londoners holed up in a pub battling the undead, then I'm definitely going to go and see it. I wish I could remember the actual experience better. I wish I could tell you that I sat there saying, oh, this is an amazing film, and in 17 years' time, I will write a book about it. I certainly enjoyed it, but actually I had quite a history some history with the director and co-writer Edgar Wright. I had grown up in Wells in Somerset, which it's technically a cathedral town. Or cathedral city, because it's got a whopping great cathedral in it, but it doesn't really have much else, to be honest with you. It's in rural Somerset, lovely part of the country, but lovely part of the world, but not always the most exciting place to be. People familiar with Edgar Wright's, the film that he made after Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, will be familiar with Wells, because that's where he shot all the exteriors. I grew up in Wells. Edgar grew up in Wells. I didn't know him. He's a few years younger than me. But when he started sort of making things, directing things, he was certainly someone I always kept an eye on. I was deputy editor of a film magazine called Neon in the mid-90s. And we got word, probably via fax would be my guess, that there was this 20-year-old kid who'd made a comedy Western called A Fistful of Fingers in Wells, Somerset, which obviously sort of attracted my attention. And I sent one of my colleagues off to interview Edgar about that. And then Edgar, A Fistful of Fingers was not a huge success. It played for 1 week at the Prince Charles Cinema in London. So, a bigger success than a lot of other films. But I think Edgar was, as he told me, he was hoping that it would be kind of, his Evil Dead, really put him on the map. And that did not come to pass. And so he sort of disappeared a little bit into the world of directing television. He did like the French and Saunders Christmas special one year and did a season of Bill Bailey's show. And then together with Simon Pegg and Jessica Hines made Spaced. And, Spaced was this sort of fantastic, groundbreaking, very, I don't want to use the word zeitgeisty because that's not a word. And even if it was, it isn't one I would necessarily want to use, but it certainly captured something. If you were certainly if like me, if you were a London dwelling, 20 something, trying to do something creative in London in the 90s, then Spaced really spoke to you. It certainly did to me. And then, and his next major project was Shaun of the Dead, which I saw in New York. And really, I certainly enjoyed it, but I think, very intelligent is the man or woman who can sort of recognize all the things that are going on in an Edgar Wright movie immediately. I'm sure it's a film I watched, a few more times and caught like a lot more things. And then, he made Hot Fuzz and then he made The World's End, this sort of accidental trilogy known as the Three Colors Cornetto trilogy, because they all feature Cornetto in them. And I think that's when, certainly around the time of Hot Fuzz, Hot Fuzz blew me away because it was set in Wells anyway, but, you start to think, wow, these guys are really good. And this is a great pair of films with Shaun and Hot Fuzz, and they're doing something, very original. It's interesting because in some ways it's very unoriginal. As they would, not that it's unoriginal, but they're certainly, referencing films that have gone before. But the way they make these films is incredibly original. They seem incredibly original. And then with The World's End, the last film in the trilogy, I was just like, wow, this is absolutely amazing. And I really do think it's one of the best. It's certainly my favorite film trilogy, which is remarkable given sort of how accidentally it came together. And so, over time, I've just fallen more and more in love with these films. And it's interesting because I do think whichever one is my favorite happens to be the one, whichever one I've seen most recently is my favorite. I would, throughout writing the book, which is called You've Got Red on You, I would have said that Shaun of the Dead was my favorite. But the other day I had cause to watch Hot Fuzz because I was talking about that to somebody. And I was like, my God, this is amazing. This is absolutely amazing. And I've always been a fan of The World's End, and sort of, I think it's many people's maybe least favorite of the Cornetto movies, but I love it. I particularly love the end when, spoiler alert, but it has a pretty apocalyptic conclusion.
Well, it's in the title.
That's true. Yeah, it is in the title. Yeah, so I just thought, what an amazing. So the answer is that I can't specifically remember. I can't specifically remember seeing much about seeing Shaun of the Dead, but I probably because I went and had a few drinks immediately after seeing it. But I was certainly aware of Edgar's work before and really fell in love with Edgar's work and Edgar and Simon and Nick and their producer Naira Park, or Edgar's producer Naira Park, and just fell in love with all the stuff they did, in the years afterwards.
What was Fistful of Fingers like? Because I've never seen that.
Well, it's interesting. It is of interest, I would say. I know that Edgar, he doesn't like to talk badly about the film because a lot of people put a lot of effort into it, and he's not someone to be like, he's someone who's always very upbeat about his work, not out of a sense of egomania, but But he's certainly not. He's not ashamed of it. But I will say that this is mentioned in the book. But when he was promoting Shaun of the Dead, people would often refer to it as Edgar's debut movie, Edgar's first movie. And he would not necessarily dissuade them of, he would not point out the mistake that they'd made. I mean, I think the word would be underfinanced was one word that comes to mind it's a bunch of 20-year-olds running around Wells in Somerset, making a comedy Western with no money and no experience. And they're not really even actors. And it kind of looks like that. I will say there are some jokes. I watched it. I hadn't seen it, but I watched it when I was writing the book. And there are definitely times when you can see that this guy would go on to do better things. I think it's fair to say.
But there seems to be a kind of aspect of it that in terms of how you describe the making of it, that runs into Shaun of the Dead as well. That sort of improvisation in the sense of using friends to come along and help out. And the way he prepares Shaun of the Dead in terms of storyboarding it in a lot of detail. I mean, I guess that's against the idea of improvisation, actually. But you know what I mean. There's a sort of do-it-yourself aspect to it. I think maybe would be a better way of looking.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. It's strange because there is an aspect to it that is very much DIY. I mean, Simon and Edgar wrote Shaun of the Dead together. And really I don't think Simon had ever written a screenplay. Edgar had written the screenplay for A Fistful of Fingers. They've got no, and they're not, and then Simon had never really starred in a film. Edgar had never really directed a film. Edgar and Simon were friends. They insisted, against many people's objections, to cast Nick Frost in, the second male lead role. At that point, Nick had appeared in Spaced. But the reason they got Nick in Spaced partly was because Simon was living with Nick at the time and wanted to hang out with his friend more. Plus that, Simon thought he was the funniest person on the planet. But I mean, lots of people think their best friends are funniest people on the planet. Now, admittedly, Simon Pegg's a stand-up comedian, so he has a better, a more reliable opinion than most on what's funny. But yeah, they got Nick on board. Working Title did not want Nick Frost to appear in the film, and he's absolutely brilliant in it. And there's definitely, all the zombies in the film were fans of Spaced, basically, or friends of Edgar and Simon's, who were paid £1 a day to appear in it. And a lot of the department heads that worked on Spaced were young, on Shaun of the Dead were young, relatively inexperienced people who'd worked with them on Spaced. And it's true, there is like a DIY aspect to it, but also, I think Edgar's very good. Edgar and Nair and Simon are very good at like picking talent. You know what I mean? They had a choice of people to work with on Spaced. And it's not a coincidence that again and again they chose people who would do a great job on Spaced and then would do a great job on Shaun of the Dead. And then, the makeup artist on both Spaced and Shaun of the Dead is this lady called Jane Walker, who would go on, to work on. She was actually quite established at the time, but I can't imagine she was. They definitely picked her, and I suppose they paid her much money. And she would go on to do like one blockbuster movie or show after another, and became the sort of head makeup designer on Game of Thrones, and won so many Emmys for Game of Thrones that it was one of the few things. Well, I guess you could say a lot of things were beyond me in writing this book. But definitely one of the few things that was beyond me was trying to work out how many Emmys Jane Walker actually won for Game of Thrones. There were so many. So yeah, there is definitely a sort of garden shed aspect to all this, not least because the garden shed features in Shaun of the Dead. But it's also that they're really talented people. It's not just they got lucky. Edgar is picking these people, and I think it was the assistant director told me, certainly somebody high up in the crew told me that his job interview for Shaun of the Dead, he arranged to meet Edgar and thought it was going to be like a 20-minute chat in a coffee shop or whatever. Met Edgar, and then Edgar produced like a foot-high stack of storyboards and was still going through them like 2 hours later when the guy who got the job had to call his partner or whatever and say he'd be late for dinner. So you know, it's, and I think this was one of the reasons that Edgar wanted, you know, I mean, Edgar, I interviewed Edgar on many, many occasions for the book, and I'd spoken to him about Shaun of the Dead, you know, a lot over the years. I think he thought, quite rightly, that a lot of people would look at Spaced to be like, oh, well, you know, they got to make Spaced, and then someone gave them the money to make Shaun of the Dead, and that must have been pretty easy. And then because it's a bit Spaced-like, presumably making Shaun of the Dead would have been pretty easy because they kind of done it before. And I think Edgar wanted to slightly put the record straight and point out that, you know, nobody wanted to give them the money for Shaun of the Dead. It was a arduous 2-year process, you know, dragging this thing up a hill. And then making the film was very, very hard. And then promoting the film, I think, was less hard. They promoted the film in a lot of ways, but Simon and Nick and Edgar went off on like a sort of month-long tour of America as if they were, you know, an indie rock band, essentially, which I'm guessing was quite enjoyable. But still, it's a lot of, you know, it's a lot of time and labor. And the funny thing was, one of the last interviews I did was with Zack Snyder, director of, you know, Dawn of the Dead, well, many other films, but Dawn of the Dead was being produced by Universal at the same time that they were financing Shaun of the Dead. And so I was interviewing Zack Snyder about Army of the Dead, which was his latest zombie film. And I said, did you ever see Shaun of the Dead? And he said, yeah, you know, the thing about Shaun of the Dead is you could just tell, like, what a laugh they had making that film. I mean, he's American, so that's because he said what a laugh, but how much fun it was making that film. And I almost said, well, I've got a 400-page book
that argues otherwise.
That contradicts that, yeah. And certainly some people, I mean, I think everybody has fond memories of making the film. A lot of people did have a good time while making the film. Some of the zombies maybe had too good a time making the film. But, you know, Edgar, you know, certainly remembers it as being, you know, very, a lot of hard work from one end to another.
Yeah, I think I was definitely one of those people who loved Spaced and saw Shaun of the Dead and watched Edgar Wright's subsequent career and kind of think, oh well, he was on that trajectory forever. That was like a thing that was in the stars. And then reading your book, it's like, wow, that there were plenty of knockbacks. There were plenty of moments where it could have just disappeared if the right person hadn't said yes at the right time. And it's interesting as well to read about how Simon Pegg, for instance, talks about how dark he was feeling at the time when they were trying to get the money.
No, absolutely. And both Simon and I mean, Simon, I should say that, I mean, Simon and Nick have both written autobiographies, which, while, I mean, the book has a lot of fresh quotes from them, you know, I mean, I did rely, you know, to some extent on their memoirs. And Nick in particular is highlighted the depression that he felt often growing up and as a young adult. Simon less so, but yeah, I think because Simon, as he's spoken about subsequently, had a problem with alcohol. And this was something that was kind of getting worse in the course of making Shaun of the Dead. And Edgar, you know, always went out of his way while talking to me to say that when Simon was around 98% of the time, and when he was around, it was amazing, both as a writer and, you know, in all ways, really, a creative partner. But sometimes he would just go absent. They would have like a meeting set up at, you know, to get finance at one of the big production companies, and Simon would call, you know, an hour before and say that he wasn't coming, which, you know, and I think part of it was that Simon, you know, like a lot of artists, like a lot of all of us, you know, doesn't always have the highest opinion of himself, I guess. Sorry, I'm a bit wary of kind of, you know, psychoanalyzing or, you know, speaking for Simon.
Sure.
But, you know, he's the front man for this film, and he's got to get up every morning and be the front man for this film. And, you know, is in the process of trying to convince, you know, people to give them money for a film of which he is going to be the star. And I think there are times when it just, you know, and you're getting rejection after rejection after rejection. And there are times when, you know, he decided that he would rather spend the afternoon in the pub than you know, being told by essentially somebody else, or doing a dog and pony show for somebody else who was not going to ultimately give them any money.
And it's striking, though, how when the cameras start to roll, he's like, oh, I'm in my happy place now. And he enjoys it much more more than Edgar does. Then Edgar goes into the dark places.
Yeah, absolutely. They talk about. I mean, talking to all of the people that played zombies and everybody really, just how Simon and Nick were kind of the front of house of the production. That Edgar was always off. I mean, Edgar would be pleasant, but was off, quote unquote, stealing shots during lunchtime that he felt he needed in the editing room, and that it was Simon and Nick who, would engage with the extras and just sort of keep morale up. And I would think it was the continuity, the script editor rather, who said that she would just listen to them in between shots, because they would do the shot, they would be in the car or whatever, and it would be Edgar and Simon and Bill Nighy and Kate Ashfield and Lucy Davis and Dylan Moran. But the script supervisor was like, well, everyone would just keep listening, because Simon and Nick would be as funny the cameras weren't rolling, as they were when the cameras were rolling. And it was like just getting this sort of like free comedy show in between shots. So yeah, I think during the actual process, I think you're absolutely right that in the actual process, Simon did have a better time than Edgar. But the other thing is Edgar's extremely talented, without a doubt. I'm not saying anything new there. But part of his talent, or rather the other thing he has, which means that his talent ultimately, that he can ultimately get this stuff on screen, is that he is on this, 22 hours a day during shooting. He is there's 100 ways that things cannot work out in the way that he imagined them working out. And he's the person, obviously with help, but he is the person that has to make sure that everything happens, essentially. And I think had he not, so he's incredibly talented, but then he's also incredibly on it. And you need, and even though that's a sort of, in some ways, not boring, but that's, people talk about skill all the time, but you've still got to be the person who makes sure that the things that you imagine end up on screen, especially when you've got no money, essentially, which is what they had.
And I mean, part of the sort of extra pressure on him is he had a pretty rapidly deteriorating relationship with his DP, who was an quite experienced American cinematographer.
Yeah, he was. David Dunlap was, someone who had been a fantastic cameraman, long history of credits, cameraman, and then sort of risen through the ranks and eventually become quite recently a cinematographer. And he had worked on, one of the reasons Edgar hired him was because he had worked on Goodfellas and The Royal Tannenbaums and Raising Arizona, which are three of Edgar's favorite movies, particularly Goodfellas and Raising Arizona, which came out when Edgar was just sort of starting to really, seriously think about films and what could be done on the screen. So it seemed like it was going to be a very happy marriage, but things did, you're right, things did deteriorate. And I think it was kind of a clash of cultures, basically, again, I'm loath to go into this. I don't mean to be like, you should buy, if you want to find out more about this, buy my book. But one of the things one of the things that really exercised me about the book was I wanted to, as far as possible, portray both sides of this argument. Particularly, I wanted to find people who could sort of, who could say how great, how much of a contribution David Dunlap made to the movie, which indeed Edgar himself would say that for the most part, the stuff that David captured, was absolutely amazing. But there was definitely a clash of attitudes. And I think it boiled down to the fact that David, was used to working on these big projects. And that here was a film that was very low budget. There was a horror movie, which is still, and even today is still regarded as, in many ways a lesser genre to, some of the other genres. And you had a young director essentially making his first film who, found it hard to explain. It wasn't that he found it hard to explain what he wanted, but if you've ever seen an Edgar Wright movie, then, you can imagine how many shots and how much coverage he wants in order to, put the film together. And I'm guessing that there were, and, Shaun of the Dead I'm not going to say Edgar invented a style of filmmaking, but he certainly, advanced the style of filmmaking that had been kind of created in a way by Sam Raimi and other, directors in the 80s. And, I don't think, essentially it boiled down to the fact that most of the people working on Shaun of the Dead, I wouldn't say they'd be happy to work 24 hours a day, but were kind of prepared to do that. And the camera department wasn't always prepared to do that.
Yeah, I think you presented it in a very even-handed way. I mean, there's a bit where he says, "Look, I need to rest. I'm carrying the camera. I'm doing the work, and when it's lunch hour, I'm gonna have lunch." It's professional. And I thought there was a really good bit where he talks about DPs who are warning him off, working with a sort of first-time filmmaker. And again, with the caveat that it's not exactly his first film, because they're willing to absolutely break everybody's necks to get the perfection that they need, and then they go off with a $1 million check, and you're left going to the next job.
No, I think that's absolutely right, Edgar. I mean, not the irony, but when I put that point to Edgar, he pointed out quite rightly that in his case, he has continued to work did continue to work with many of the heads of department. I mean, basically, many of the people that worked with him on Shaun of the Dead carried on working with him on, bigger, more successful, and I'm guessing, often more lucrative films. I mean, lucrative in the sense of being paid. But David was the one person that he, did not work with again. Although I have to say, there is a sort of David Dunlap appeared, came to a screening of Shaun of the Dead when they were on the promotional tour, and Edgar talks about going out for a drink with him, and it was all like as if nothing had happened, which is quite nice. And I mean, David Dunlap, when I interviewed him a couple of times, just seemed like a delightful guy, right. and it's just like a sort of clash of cultures, and it's one of those things that because David, it turns out, is sort of on the wrong side of history with this, then it's easy to kind of point a finger at him. But, there's another world where, say it's another story, a different film where the DP's refusing to, is coerced into working long hours, and then something terrible happens, and, and the film never comes out, or is terrible, or whatever, I mean, there are various ways that this can go. It's just unfortunate for David, as I said, that Edgar Wright went on to be like Edgar Wright. So, it's sort of, that's proven correct in some ways. But there's, I mean, you've read the book, so but there is a word caveat to this, there is a word epilogue to this, that David went on to be an Emmy-winning, the Emmy-winning cinematographer on House of Cards. House of Cards or House of Games? I always get confused. It's House of House of Cards, right? It's House of Cards. I always get confused with it because there's a movie called House of Games.
Yeah, House of Games is a David Mamet movie, isn't it?
That's right. I always get too confused. So, it's a happy ending for David Dunlap. He goes, it was he has this incredible career, then, joins the team of House of Cards, wins an Emmy. But then Edgar is shooting Baby Driver, which stars, amongst other people, Kevin Spacey, and needs to do, the main shoot is over, and then he realizes he needs 1 or 2 months of Kevin Spacey. But Kevin Spacey is shooting House of Cards at this point, and so he has to go to the set of House of Cards to get this shot of Kevin Spacey and, see David Dunlap again. Although, again, Edgar was said, it was quite amicable and and so on and so forth.
What about when I was reading this, I was also thinking about, you mentioned at one point comic strip, the sort of Pete Richardson, is it Peter Richardson? Mm-hmm. Rick Mayall's alternative comedy sort of group. And and also thinking about the French and Saunders special that Edgar directs, there's a real strong legacy and tradition of parody in British comedy, and more specifically British television. And I often think of, I sort of, it made me think that Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz and the trilogy sort of really lock into that tradition, perhaps more so than America. I know in America you got sort of Mel Brooks and all the scary movies, but
there is. I mean, it is interesting that Naira Park, Edgar's producer, who you could describe as the 5th Beatle of this operation, except I think really she's the 4th Beatle. Her first job was working for the comic strip. She was obsessed with the show. I think she said she canceled a holiday or came back early from a holiday, when she was growing up or as a teenager to see an episode. and started off literally cleaning out Peter Richardson's garage. I think was her first job on the show, and then ultimately became the producer. And then Simon Pegg is in the movie that Rick Mayall and Ada Edmondson did, whose name escapes me, Hotel. It was like a riff on Hotel Paradiso. I can't quite remember the name of the film. So there are definitely connections, but I don't know. I feel like if Edgar and Simon were here, they would want me to point out that they do not regard Shaun of the Dead as a parody of the zombie film, of the zombie genre. Simon's always keen on pointing out that they didn't set out to parody the zombie film. They set out to make a zombie film. What they set out to parody was the sort of Richard Curtis penned London set, romantic comedy of Four Weddings and a Funeral and Notting Hill and so on and so forth. And one of the pitches that one of the sort of, one sentence pitches that they would give to financiers, usually unsuccessfully, was Richard Curtis shot in the head. So, and that the comedy, I mean, they were not unaware of the comedic potential of zombies, but that the comedy was this jarring, in a good way, the jarring way in which the zombie film kind of rubbed up against both the Richard Curtis movie and also kind of the Mike Leigh movie. I think one of their other pitches was Life is Sweet with Zombies, Life is Sweet being a Mike Leigh movie. So I don't know. I mean, there were definitely, but I think it's almost more like The Goodies. I mean, most people listening to this might want to ask their fathers or their parents or grandparents about The Goodies. But I think that maybe was more of an influence, or The Young Ones. I mean, I know The Young Ones is kind of comic strip adjacent anyway, but I think maybe that was more of an influence on them.
I suppose there's an embarrassment of riches when you're looking at British comedy from the 80s, 90s, and on. What about zombies themselves? Because there's a very clear idea that they love zombie movies, and there's many moments in the book where people who are involved in the making of the film sort of bond over a mutual love of zombies. For the most part, there are some people who say, I don't understand zombies. What's your personal relationship with zombies, with The Walking Dead, so to speak?
I just loved them. I mean, I've always been a horror fan. I went to see, for some deranged reason, my father took me to see the 70s version of The Island of Dr. Moreau with Michael York and Burt Lancaster.
Burt Lancaster, yes.
I can remember this clear as day, at the Midsomer Norton Palladium in Midsomer Norton, which is about 12 miles east of Wells. And I can just remember being terrified by it. And there was one point where I said to my dad, this is frightening me. Can we go? And he said, we can go, but we're leaving. Like if we go, then we're going home. We're not going to hang around in the foyer waiting for it to get less scary. So I stuck around, and I often think if I left, maybe I'd be like the prime minister at this point, because I would have become interested in other things. I think the chances of me being the prime minister are pretty slim, but
I'm not sure, man. I think you're probably overqualified at the moment.
The thought does occur to me. But no, that really set me on my path. And certainly zombies were just something that fascinated me. I was somewhat late to it. I saw George Romero's Day of the Dead when I was 18. And it just blew me away. I'd never seen anything like it. And it really did haunt my dreams.
Day of the Dead is my favorite as well. Day of the Dead is definitely my favorite. And I'm not sure why it always seems to come third place I mean, I know Dawn of the Dead has the sort of political satire of commercialism and stuff, but Day of the Dead always struck me as the most terrifying.
I agree. And the effects are amazing. I'm a big fan of Day of the Dead. It's probably the one that I would, put on out of the three. Also, talking about The Walking Dead, Greg Nicotero plays a kind of stoner soldier at the start, which is always fun, and then gets his head removed. This is just something I tried to impart in the book, and I think everybody tried to sort of impart, was that it is impossible to describe to young people today how damn hard it was trying to find these things. Yes, Day of the Dead would have been released on video, but if you were trying to find other zombie movies, of which there weren't many anyway, then it was really, really difficult. And Edgar talks about wanting to see Night of the Living Dead. Parents didn't have a video recorder. His parents weren't that well off. And so, he had to wait for it to be screened on, where he lives at like 3 o'clock in the morning. The next day, having stayed up till 5 o'clock watching Night of the Living Dead. It was really hard to find these things. That was part of the appeal. I think also, the horror genre, as I said, was not that well regarded in the in the 80s. And the zombie genre was kind of, I don't know, just like the least sexy genre, both in terms of like it literally not being sexy and in terms of like hipness, I guess. It was really for the hardcore horror geeks. It's sort of like no fun. I mean, even though it is quite fun, I think it was perceived as sort of, no fun. And for the walk, and so to, 30 years on or whatever, to witness The Walking Dead become the most successful, TV show in the world really did kind of blow my mind. But that was my relationship with zombies, and it was kind of Edgar and Simon's relationship with zombies, and the last, before 28 Days Later and Shaun of the Dead, the last sort of like gasp of the zombie film had been Day of the Dead, which was released the same year as Night of the Living Dead. So you had as Return of the Living Dead, which is a more comedic approach, but it's also a really great movie. But then it just sort of, people stopped making them, and Edgar and Simon thought, one of the aces they had up their sleeve was that no one had made a zombie film in 15 years, and that people, so it was like fallow earth. And
explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
Then Edgar tells a very funny story about, they were writing the film, essentially. And Simon came in and said, do you know Danny Boyle's making a zombie film? And Edgar, and this being 28 Days Later, and Edgar recalling just smashing his head into the desk for half an hour because just being so annoyed that the wind had sort of been taken out of their sails by 28 Days Later.
That's such a horrible. Yeah, I've been on a couple of creative endeavors which have been sort of gazumped by something else turning up. Most recently, a Gerard Butler film called Greenland, which shared a title of something I was working on, and it's like, oh God damn it!
You can always change that. It's not. To be fair, it's not that great a title. I mean, no offense to Gerard Butler or you, but
no, it is in mine. That's the thing. It's kind of really central to the concept. So it's like I can't call it Iceland. It would be, Mum's Gone to Iceland then.
Well, funny enough, I don't know, but this year there have been 2 sort of low budget acclaimed movies, both called Swan Song. One of them with who's the horror legend that's in the first Swan Song he's in Suspiria and
Udo Kier.
Udo Kier, yes, the great Udo Kier, who I interviewed for Swan Song, so I really should remember it. To be honest, I found the pandemic has not done much for my not great, instant recall anyway. But yeah, so Udo Kier is in this movie Swan Song, which was released in the summer, and then Mahershala Ali is in this other movie called Swan Song, and you're like, well, it's not. Why don't you change the title? It's not like. I mean, frankly, Swan Song could be like you could name half the movies ever made Swan Song, really. And it's not like, I don't know. It's just for some reason it really infuriates me that there's 2 movies called that. But funnily, I mean, Shaun of the Dead was not. I think they originally pitched it as Tea Time of the Dead. I mean, the fact that it's called Shaun of the Dead was one of the reasons why they not a huge reason perhaps, but certainly one of the reasons why they had getting finance, because it's kind of a crappy pun. And nowadays, Shaun of the Dead is, the thing is, it's like the Beatles. So the Beatles, it's a crappy pun, which I'm sure when they started, some people must have been like, sure, the Beatles. But of course, you just don't even register what it means anymore, and I think that's what's happened with Shaun of the Dead. But Edgar told me that they'd written the script or were writing the script, and Edgar met Ricky Gervais in London, just on the street, and they went and had a drink. And I think Ricky was just about, the first season of The Office was about to come out, and Ricky had appeared briefly in Spaced. So Ricky said, "What have you been working on?" And Edgar said, "Well, we got, Simon and I have been writing this zombie comedy called Shaun of the Dead." And Ricky Gervais said, "Nah, but what's it really called?" Because he couldn't believe that anybody would. And I distinctly remember thinking, when I found out that there was a movie called Shaun of the Dead, that with a title like that, it really can't, how good can it be? Which, shows me, obviously. But in many ways, it's sort of like the broadest joke in the whole film, and maybe not the best joke in the whole film. Of course, now it doesn't matter. What does it matter? People love the film.
It's like a placeholder that then
Yes.
becomes like that's it. That's the title in the end.
Yeah, but turns out I was completely wrong, as I am about so many things.
Oh, aren't we all? Aren't we all? What about so how did you sort of come about writing the book then? What was your sort of journey towards that? What was the
I had interviewed. I did the first time I really interviewed all of them or any of them. I think was around Hot Fuzz. I sat down and Hot Fuzz came out in America quite a while after it did in Britain, and it was a huge success in Britain, as you may well recall. Just like like as if it was Titanic or whatever. I pitched doing a piece on them, Edgar and Simon and Nick, to Entertainment Weekly, so I interviewed them then, and then over the years had interviewed them about The World's End and sort of individual projects they did. I visited the set of Scott Pilgrim in Toronto when Edgar was directing that. So I'd gotten on, I would not say I was, friends with them, but they'd know who I was. And then about 4 years ago, we did so I work for Entertainment Weekly magazine in America. I'm a senior writer. I've been working there for 15 years or so. And we did a Halloween issue of Entertainment Weekly. I was asked to, I did an oral history of Shaun of the Dead, and I re-interviewed Edgar and Simon and Nick and Kate Ashfield, who plays Liz, and Naira, who reluctantly got on the phone. And I was not one to really pop her head above. She's fantastic producer and great person, but is not one to volunteer to sort of get in the spotlight, really. And I interviewed Bill Nye about something else around the same time and shot him a couple of questions about Shaun of the Dead. So what is that, like 5 people, 6 people? The oral history was probably about 1,500 words, came together quite well. And I was like, oh, well, that seemed all right. And then I've always been keen. I've always wanted to write a book, and I've always very much enjoyed books about films. I don't know how much you wanted me to talk about this, but like going back to Stephen Back's book, The Final Cut, which is about the making, which is really possibly I think it is the best book about making a movie. Stephen Back was a producer on Heaven's Gate, and so he wrote a book about the making of Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate and the sort of unmaking of United Artists. And he was like, the great thing is he had total access. He was the access, it wasn't like he was, best friends with the producer. He was the producer, essentially, or one of the executives. And also he's a really, I thought he was a really good writer. So I'd loved that book. And I'd loved books about films in general over the years. The book about Bonfire of the Vanities, The Devil's Candy, which is great, which was recently turned into a fantastic podcast.
I just had her on the podcast. She was a couple of episodes back.
Oh, great. I thought that was amazing. I thought that was absolutely amazing, and a lesson, keep your tapes. Always keep your interview tapes. Because, the fantastic thing about that, it's a great book, but she had, she just kept the tape running all the time, and people knew that that's what she was doing. And then, for her to be able to describe meetings and then you hear the tape of the meeting is quite extraordinary. So I'd always be interested in it. I had done the oral history of Shaun of the Dead. I felt, they are a story. Edgar and Simon and Nick are a story in as much as, they're friends who made a movie, and that movie is partly about their friendship. So, it's not like people are sitting around going, all right, we're going to make a movie about Thor. What's that going to be about? Like it's, no offense to people who make movies about Thor. I love a lot of those films, but this is just an extraordinary situation where you had people, Simon Pegg and Nick Frost play flatmates, roommates, and they were flatmates, which is extraordinary. And at the time, I think, or maybe, they just stopped being, I think they were still flatmates at the time. It's crazy, really. And also, I felt as growing up in Wells, roughly at the same time as Edgar, I had a good handle on being able to describe that what that was like, and the sense of Hollywood being the sense of Bristol being a long way away from where you're growing up, and it's only like 20 miles down the road. So Hollywood just seemed like unreachable. Yeah, so I thought, okay, well, maybe I've got the bones of a book here, and I've interviewed 5 people, and I mean, how many people am I going to be interviewing here? Like, I don't know, like 15 or whatever. And I wasn't like, I'll knock it out, but I was like, oh, it'll be a nice breezy book about how these people made a movie and had a lovely time, and I'll interview like 15 people, and it'll be like 170 pages. That seems not unreasonable for a book about Shaun of the Dead, I thought. And then, as I've been talking about, I started talking to Edgar, and he was like, I would really like to talk about how hard this was. And so you kind of think, well, there's more of a story here. And the other thing is that Edgar is someone who likes to justify, with good reason, likes to credit his collaborators. So he's like, oh, you really should speak to this person or that person. So suddenly I'm talking to a lot of department heads and getting some great stuff from them. And the other thing is, as I said, that Edgar and Simon have always made it clear that without the people who turned up to portray zombies for £1 a day, there wouldn't be a movie. So I thought, I'll start interviewing the zombies. And so I would talk to one zombie, and they put me in touch with another. And then there's quite a few people who played zombies who are friends of Edgar's that have gone on to be like notable film folks. So Joe Cornish, the director of Attack the Block and The Kid Who Would Be King, is in it. Corin Hardy, who directed The Hallow, and then The Nun, which was a huge hit, and is now recently been working on Gangs of London, which is this great British gangster series. He plays a zombie. In fact, Joe and Corin play zombies in the same shot of the film, which is pretty incredible. So I'm interviewing them, and then I realized that the story of how they publicized it in America, how they promoted it in America, was sort of worthy of its own chapter. And there were various people who helped them do that, both at Focus Films, including there was a lot of folks at Focus Films, including James Seamus, who was the head of Focus Films, but was also Ang Lee's sort of creative partner. So I'm talking to him, and he's recommending other people to talk to. And then I'm talking to Greg Nicotero, who, Greg Nicotero was one of the huge inspirations for the film, and as much as he worked on in the 80s, worked on a lot of the films that inspired Shaun of the Dead, including Day of the Dead. He fell in love with Shaun of the Dead, and said anything I can do to promote it. And it didn't really have a premiere in the States, but it had like a sort of Los Angeles premiere at the ArcLight in Hollywood, RIP, where Eli Roth turned up. Eli Roth was another sort of booster of the film, and Quentin Tarantino, and Greg Nicotero sort of did zombie makeups for audience members. So what I planned, having originally planned to only talk to 20 or 30 people, I wound up talking to around 70 people. And this book went from being, I guess, what I thought would be 200 pages to being like 450 pages. Although there are a lot of, there are a fair amount of photographs and storyboards and what have you. So that's it. And I think it's worth, this book still could be 200 pages, but I thought it was worthwhile. I wanted to include quotes from everybody I interviewed. I felt everybody I spoke to had things to say. And so I just thought, and also it was during COVID time. So, I don't know, it's not like anyone's really stopping me in any way. So I thought, well, maybe one day there'll be another book about Shaun of the Dead, but probably not for a while. So I might as well put the whole kitchen sink into it. Although I have to say there were longer versions, remarkably. So it's not just sort of like Stephen King in his coking days, just writing and writing and writing. But also I really enjoyed doing it. I really enjoyed the process of doing it. I was in a somewhat bleak place when I started, and working on it really, really put me straight.
You mentioned in the acknowledgements, actually, that it's similar to Simon Pegg doing his acting and being in a happy place when the cameras start rolling, that you felt the writing of the book was a similar sort of tonic.
Yeah, no, that's true. I was in a desperately depressed state about 3 years ago. And to be honest, what I should have done was see a therapist. I mean, there's no, and I'm not, basically I should have seen a therapist. Instead, I wrote a book about Shaun of the Dead and feel much better. But I'm just saying that because I don't want people who might be feeling depressed to think, oh, all I need to do is take on some extraordinarily difficult writing task and everything will be fine. But I have to say that, I leapt out of bed in them. When I was doing all this, I was also, I had a full-time job at Entertainment Weekly magazine. But the good thing is, I say it's full-time, and in any given week, it is a full-time job, but there'll be days when I'm, plenty of Saturdays and Sundays when I'm working all the time. But on the other hand, there are, days during the week when I'm not. So it is, it does allow a certain flexibility. But it was such a thrill to talk to people. And I guess I thought the story was going to be one that I knew when I started writing the book. And it was so much fun because a lot of entertainment journalism, a lot of the time you're sort of recapping, you're not just recapping episodes for, a lot of people do that, episodes of shows or whatever, but you're sort of recapping people's lives and you're sort of asking them about things they've talked a lot about before. And then you ask about the new thing they're doing. So it is sort of like a fresh look at somebody, but you're not always bringing something that new to the table. And this was, I really didn't know half of what, the story of Shaun of the Dead. And so it was so fun I would interview someone in the afternoon, and then I would, get up in the morning and transcribe it. And then I would sort of stick that stuff into the book. And then, they maybe have in the course of the interview had referenced somebody else or suggested I speak to somebody else who I hadn't spoken to that could add, another fresh layer to the story. And so I would then be, trying to contact them. And I wrote it relatively quickly, and I had done a lot of research, and I could argue I'd done 52 years of research by that point, but I had done a fair amount of research and had some quotes, but really the whole thing was kind of done in a 6 to 9 month period, which sort of seems crazy now. I can't believe the person I was a year ago was this like hardworking, really. Now it seems like I can barely get out of bed some days. But it's fun. It's fun because it's like a linear story. And so every time, you're like, well, this is okay. Some days I would wake up and be like, this is terrible. I can't imagine anyone's going to be interested in it. But most days I woke up and would be adding stuff to a story that, I didn't have to rewrite things necessarily, but would be just making this story better, which was, a real thrill. Yeah, it was a real pleasure to write.
I talked recently to Ian Nathan, and he was talking about writing his Peter Jackson book, and he made the point, which I think is very good, that all those books that we love about filmmaking, like Devil's Candy, like The Final Cut, are all about these big failures. But he said, what happens when you write a book about the making of a really successful film? And I think the point that I sort of took home from it was similar to your book, in that it's a really successful film, it's a success story, but behind that success, there's almost just as much pain and just as much sort of like, certainly as much hard work and drama and all these other things as there is when it's a Michael Cimino, over-the-top disaster of a movie.
Yeah, I think the difference is that when things go wrong, you suddenly have from a writer's point of view, if you're lucky, you suddenly have a lot of people pointing fingers at each other.
Right.
Whereas with success, people are less worried about, are less interested in opening old wounds. So I guess that's true. Yeah, no, I know Ian was actually very helpful in terms of helping me out with a few contacts for the book. He's a great guy.
Yeah, friend of the podcast.
Well, I used to, because he worked at Empire for a long time, and I worked at Empire. And really writing for Empire was my first experience about writing about film. My first sort of my first proper set visit really was Cutthroat Island, the somewhat misbegotten Gina Davis pirate vehicle from the mid-90s.
Yeah, God, it was Pirates of the Caribbean before its time, wasn't it?
Yes, well, certainly before its time. I don't certainly, or after, possibly after its time. It was certainly not the right time to be releasing a Gina Davis, Matthew Modine pirate spectacular. But I was flown to Malta to witness this thing, and it was quite incredible. It's not unusual to go to a set visit and, for it to be not spectacular, particularly if it's inside. But this was just a mammoth production with Rennie Harlan, who was the film's director, and Gina Davis's boyfriend at the time. I think I can't.
Yeah,
quite
they
remember
didn't. I think they even got married, didn't they?
Yeah, that's why I'm slightly hesitating. Maybe they did get married, but he was sort of overseeing, this carriage chase through, sort of streets in Malta. And I remember there was like 300 extras, and as soon as Rennie Harlin called cut, like what seemed like every one of them just pulled out like a packet of Benson Hedges or whatever and lit up, like while standing on some sort of mound in Malta. And it's funny because you'll go on a set and quite reasonably, and do a set visit, and you'll come back and quite reasonably people, colleagues will be like, "What, does it look good? Does this film look good?" And I always think about going on the set of Cutthroat Island and being like, "This looks amazing. I mean, this looks absolutely amazing. This is gonna break box office records around the world." But of course, that did not turn out to be the case.
I had a friend who worked on a film, Antonio Banderas film called The 13th Warrior, which was
John McTiernan, right?
Exactly, yeah. And they went there, it was a pretty difficult slog of a shoot. And they all went to the premiere and they were all absolutely convinced this was going to be the biggest film they'd ever worked on individually. They were all quite experienced as well. And they went to the premiere and they were just like, "Oh, no, it's a piece of shit."
Well, I remember I did an oral history of Big Trouble in Little China a couple of years ago.
Right.
And, I mean, I love John Carpenter. Who doesn't love John Carpenter? But he is quite a taciturn individual in interviews. I mean, actually, it's funny because he's always game to do an interview. And I have had good interviews with him. But he's not really one for looking back on his past glories or past box office bombs in this case. Although I know, it has become obviously a lot of people love Big Trouble in Little China. But so he was a bit taciturn. But then Kurt Russell, I got on the phone. He was amazing. He was just like story after story and fantastic. And he had like workmen working on his house. And so the phone kept on being cut off. And I would be like, I bet he doesn't phone back. And he always phoned back. He was great. But he talked about, I guess, the journalists saw a preview of Big Trouble in Little China and then interviewed him. And he said all the journalists were like, "Wow, what's it like knowing that you're going to become a huge star after this film becomes so successful?" And he said that he would like say, "Well, you never know with these things." But he was like inside, he was like, "Yeah, this thing's gonna just be like the biggest movie ever, and I am gonna be a huge star." And of course, that it did not pan out like that. Although, I mean, he's Kurt Russell, so what does he care?
Just thinking as well about Matthew Modine, what a strange concertinaing of time when there was a moment in history where people went, Matthew Modine is going to lead movies and he's going to be the new action adventure star. And then he's Stranger Things' dad,
My memory is what happened was that Michael Douglas was supposed to be cast opposite Gina Davis. And then he dropped out. And I think they were in a bit of a rush to find somebody else. Although Matthew Modine was coming off, it was not that long after Full Metal Jacket, I believe, or it was only a few years after Full Metal Jacket.
And he did Birdie. He had a couple of a couple of really good films there.
Oliver Reed was supposed to be in Cutthroat Island, and he got fired. And I was trying to find out why.
Take a wild guess.
That's true. But it wasn't because of that. Although his drinking might have. My memory, this is now a long time ago, and I don't think I'm sure I've never told the story in a public forum, and it gets a bit after dark. You might want to include this in an after dark section. But I was sort of bugging Matthew Modine about why Oliver Reed got fired, and my recollection is that he said that Oliver Reed had said to, and also this is basically a kids movie. It was certainly marketed as a kids movie, not an X-rated movie. But he suggested to Rennie Harlin one day that when his character met Gina Davis, that his character should be seen masturbating in front of Gina Davis. And the next day, or probably later on that day, Oliver Reed was summarily fired from Cutthroat Island. And so that's what happened.
Wow.
I cannot remember the name of Udo Kier from interviewing him 3 months ago. So that's my cautiousness about I'm pretty sure what happened. And also it seems eminently believable, both that he would do that and then be fired.
That was such a weird period when they because Rennie Harlin had a real run of movies that they were never ever particularly good, but he was a name that was being conjured. He did Die
He was
Hard
huge. I mean,
2.
Cliffhanger, Die Hard 2. I mean, yeah, huge. And he was, I mean, my experience of him was it was a very amenable guy. And I remember like he was at Video Village or whatever. And it was this massive extravaganza, as I said, hundreds of extras. And he like took the time to chat with us about, you know, what was going on, which I thought was, I was thinking if I was Rennie Harlin, I'd be like, I wouldn't have the time to do this. But it's true there is a lot of waiting around on film sets, even if you're the guy in charge.
What's the best film set you've been on in terms of sort of getting a real insight?
I don't know about getting a real insight, because they do tend to, you know, these things do tend to be pretty swiftly, you know, pretty expertly chaperoned. I know the director Richard Stanley has had some sort of issues over the past year, but it was announced that Richard Stanley was directing an adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space, starring Nick Cage. And I was in New York at the time, and I flew myself on my own money to go on the set of in Portugal of that, so that I could see Richard Stanley direct Nicolas Cage in an H.P. Lovecraft movie in like basically what seemed to be like a semi-haunted farmhouse in the middle of nowhere in Portugal, and was just thrilled to be there. The same, actually, talking about Kurt Russell, I did the same. I flew myself across America to go on the set of Bone Tomahawk, because if someone's going to make a cannibal western starring Kurt Russell, then I want to be there. And that was genuinely fantastic, actually, because it was at one of these it was at the Paramount Ranch, which is now burned down, which was Paramount Studios sort of like ranch, where they got a standing set, Old West set. Kurt was just telling me how he'd been on that set like 50 years previously, you know, as a child star, you know, doing some sort of Western. And yeah, that was just amazing. It was so hot. And Kurt was wearing like 17 layers of clothing and just didn't seem bothered by any of it. He was just,
what a pro.
Yeah.
One last question that I have for you, Clark, is we already started talking about them. Maybe you mentioned one already, but we'd like to have a film book recommendation for our listeners. So what would be your film book recommendation?
Ooh, well, that's a good one. Let me think. I mean, the obvious ones, you know, as I said, The Final Cut, Raging Bull's Easy Riders. I do quite like the recent book about Chinatown. Is it called The Big Knife?
The Big Goodbye.
The Big Goodbye. There you go.
Sam Watson.
The Goodfellas book, I by Glenn Kenny, I enjoyed. I mean, a book I've read a lot is the book about George Romero called The Zombies That Ate Pittsburgh. And it's a book that is extremely expensive to buy online now. It's been out of print for, I think it now like costs £200. And I'm not recommending that people pay £200 for it, but I am always, the number of times that I'm like, oh, I don't need to take this. When I move, I don't need to take this book. And I'm like, God damn it, now I have to buy this book online because it is actually essential for something that I'm writing. I'm sure as soon as this ends, I'm gonna. You had Mark Harris on, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I loved his Pictures of the Revolution book. Although, funnily enough, the film I was most interested in was Dr. Dolittle, which is kind of a film. I mean, it is, you know, part of the whole thesis, I guess, is changing of the guard. But I guess partly because I had read a lot about the other films, Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate, and so it was just fun that Mark went such in depth on this like preposterous and stupid movie, which is like now not remembered at all, basically starring Rex Harrison as Dr. Dolittle and all the sort of disasters that fell out. And I have to say that his Mike Nichols book I'm reading and I've read, and it's just exceptionally good. He's a former colleague of mine, former editor of mine. Although I wouldn't say that. I mean, we didn't work together for that long at Entertainment Weekly, but he's, you know, a quite brilliant writer. But again, I am kind of drawn more to the Mike Nichols films that go horribly wrong, like Catch-22 and the George C. Scott movie about dolphins. I'm sort of much more interested in that at this point than like, again, partly because I've read a lot about The Graduate, and you know, but yeah, I am kind of drawn to catastrophe in a. And you're right, it hadn't really occurred to me that the Shaun of the Dead does kind of have all, like, in many ways it is almost a surprise that it has a happy ending, because it does have the makings of you expect, and then, and obviously because of the earthquake, they all got swallowed up into the ground.
His mate couldn't act. His mate that he lived with was absolutely awful. Why did he insist on that? He should have let Helen Mirren play that role.
No, quite. So I guess I'm desperately trying to think of one more, film book that because I'm trying to think of another one, but I guess I should say Nick and Simon's memoirs. Nick Frost and Simon Pegg. They're really nice, heartfelt memoirs. Although I have to say, this isn't in the book, but I know Edgar, because Edgar talks about how how he read in Simon's book. It sort of goes from, well, this is what Edgar said. He's like, well, I read Simon's book, and it went from like, we made Space and had a nice time, and then we made Shaun of the Dead, and we also had a nice time. And Edgar was like, wanted to call him up and be like, and say, do you not remember the 2 years we spent trying to get the finance for that film? And so, Shaun of the Dead is not, my book is not a memoir of Edgar Wright, but I think there's certainly elements in there that, he sort of corrected felt that he was correcting Simon's version. And Simon's book was written before he sort of talked about his alcohol problems. And I think Edgar would like Simon to write a new book, which sort of, he just had a thought that maybe, Simon could write a follow-up that addressed that. That would be, another sort of great book. So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, listen, Clark, thanks so much for spending some time and talking about your book. It's a really great read. I really enjoyed it, and it's going to do that thing that all great film books do. It's going to send me back to the film to watch it again, I think.
I have to say, I thought there would come a point when I was writing the book that I would get sick of watching Shaun of the Dead, but it never happened. It really didn't. It's not like I would get up and watch it like 3 times in a row. And a lot of the time you're watching sort of, isolated bits to fact check what you're saying. But what struck me, I talked to the Steadicam operator. There's 2 long shots near the beginning of Shaun of the Dead where Simon goes to the shop twice, which I don't know. No wonder they didn't get. They're brilliant shots, but no wonder they found it hard to get finance if that's like the scenes that you're looking at. But I was talking to the Steadicam operator or somebody, and they were just saying how incredible it was that Simon was kind of creating a character just through little things that he was doing, just kind of like trying to open the can of Coke with his teeth or whatever. And far from putting me off watching Shaun of the Dead, it sort of, writing the book really enriched the experience, I have to say.
Yeah, I remember seeing Simon Pegg on so many things. Big Train, of course, was a really big one, as well as Spaced. But he was even in sort of a sitcom which wasn't great, and he was the kind of Kramer character, the kind of, the comedic crazy. And it was so obvious that he was just trying so hard, to do something good, even if when sometimes the context was great, Big Train, sometimes the context not so great, this sort of fairly run-of-the-mill sitcom, So it was really good success story.
With Linda Bellingham, I think the sitcom was with Linda Bellingham, wasn't he? Like the daughter's boyfriend. I think Julius Sawalha was in it, perhaps. Maybe I'm getting my 90s sitcoms and my OXO ads confused, but there you go. Again, listeners, ask your parents and grandparents what I'm talking about.
The only people listening to this are grandparents. What are you talking about?
Great. Fantastic.
It's brilliant. It's been really good talking to you, Clark. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I'm sorry that I was worried that because I have sort of been in a room like so many of us for the last 18 months. And so if anybody says to me, Shaun of the Dead, then I just start talking and eventually, the computers wind down and I go silent. But thank you so much for having me on. This has been fantastic, and it's a genuine honor, to be on a podcast where you have had so many people that have written these fabulous books about films.
So that was our conversation. Clark recommended a whole bunch of books. Nick Frost's and Simon Pegg's memoirs were 2 that he recommended. He also recommended a load of books. I'm really proud of this, the fact that people have been doing this a lot recently, that a lot of people's recommended books end up being people that we've already had on the podcast. You know, Sam Wasson with The Big Goodbye. Mark Harris has been cited a number of times by a number of writers for his Mike Nichols biography, but also Pictures from a Revolution. And Glenn Kenny was cited for his Goodfellas book, Made Men. You go back and listen to some of those episodes if you haven't had the opportunity. They're really, really good. It's really interesting, actually, to go back and listen to the first episode when I had never done a podcast before, and I don't think it's necessarily the case that I've improved any, but yeah, it certainly makes for an interesting listen. All that I need to do now is thank Elliot Atkins for providing the music, Ali Harwood for providing the artwork, and until our next episode, please, everybody, take care.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.